Yes. Yes.
So welcome, Grahame. So we have Grahame Grieve. He is a god in digital health, I'd say. He is the inventor of FHIR from HL7. He is a specialist in interoperability in Australia and worldwide, does a lot of consulting worldwide. I've met him and invited him as keynote for various peak body conferences. And we're here to speak to him about the truth about interoperability for intrapreneurs, those who want to innovate within organizations, and entrepreneurs. Welcome, Grahame. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hey, Barry, and hello, everyone. So I started as a clinical scientist in a hospital, did a bit of clinical research. I got kicked out of the hospital in the Kennett reforms and ended up working for Kestrel and ended up running development, hiring, firing, and so forth, product development at Kestrel, which is radiology and pathology systems. Then I quit to go freelance consulting, was consulting to the national systems around the world on clinical data exchange. And then I went ahead and, out of the dissatisfaction at the existing alternatives, I went ahead and created FHIR. And it's after 10 years of sort of being at the helm of FHIR, it's now the de facto healthcare data exchange standard in most countries. And I'm busy steering the community and maintaining the tools and doing the politics around that project.
Great. So in essence, why did you create it? What is FHIR?
So FHIR is a web-based API. So using the web technologies and techniques and community developing facilities that describes how you would use services from one piece of software in another, and those services represent logical building blocks for healthcare operations. And so it allows you to coordinate clinical practice, clinical process, administrative process between different pieces of software. And, you know, a typical hospital has thousands of bits of software from different providers, all performing its own specific purpose. And yeah, sure, you can buy them all from a single provider, but then you get the average of all cases rather than the best of cases. And in some cases, you simply need the best in order to do good, you know, world-class clinical service. But it, you know, if you don't have the ability to integrate the software, then you end up paying someone to do huge amounts of data replication and always chasing your tail on that. So everybody's interested in hooking up software so that they can talk to each other directly. And FHIR is sort of all-purpose, general purpose API for exchanging data in healthcare.
Right. So is it being used in Australia at all?
Yeah, it is being used in some specific areas. There isn't the same widespread adoption in Australia as there is in other countries, the USA or, you know, in Europe, where they're doing more and more clinical data exchange. But because of politics, really, in Australia, its time will come. But in the meantime, most of the use in Australia is very niche, particular project usage, vendors using it internally for data exchange. The National Clinical Terminology Service runs on top of FHIR, so those are particular use cases that are being done with FHIR.
So correct me if I'm wrong, is it being used by the government at the moment in Australia for anything?
A little bit. So they built the My Health record. It's based on a set of static documents that people upload to the My Health record. And it uses a very old interface method. So in order to improve it, we put a way to interact with it in FHIR, and I help them describe an API for doing so, which they call a mobile API to My Health record. That has a little bit of use, but they haven't really, the idea of sharing documents, you don't run an enterprise on a document repository. You actually use enterprise systems to run, and they really need to move forward and figure out, start asking the question, what does it actually look like to actually integrate healthcare? Now that we've actually I mean, My Health Record was a big achievement that made some significant progress at the political level. It didn't fix the healthcare. It doesn't solve the healthcare problems, but it solved the political problems. So now we need to go and say, well, what do we actually need to do with the system and design the system? It's not going to work to simply put an API over a system that doesn't meet the needs. So they really need to do the needs analysis and revisit the system. But yeah, it's politics. We're going to try and stick with the system that we have because it's a political solution rather than a system solution. And we had to have a political solution, so you can't argue with that. So it's work in progress, and it does use FHIR, but it doesn't use it well. That's kind of what I'm saying.
Right. On that point, I know that Apple and Google have implemented FHIR standards. What applications have they used it in overseas?
Well, I mean, it's pretty interesting because for 20 years, companies like Apple and Google and Microsoft and Oracle, if they wanted to get into healthcare, they would have to produce some kind of vertical stack application, full-blown enterprise information management system for some part of healthcare. And my experience as a vendor and my experience from watching other vendors is it's a 15-year business proposal. You will not break even until 10, and you won't profit until 15. And that's just how it is. It's just such a lot of complexity. And the boards of those companies at the year 7 point, somewhere between sort of 6 and 8 years, they just go, when are we going to make money from doing this? When is pouring resources into this for no profit? And then they pull it because they can. You won't succeed in healthcare unless you're totally dedicated to healthcare. It's just too easy to make money elsewhere. And so they do. They pulled the pin on their projects repeatedly, and you can see that. But with FHIR, they've looked at it and said, there's enough basic interoperability that we no longer need to enter in vertical competition with the vertical software providers, who's all specialists. Instead, we're actually going to come with our niche skill. So Apple's niche skill is consumer access. So Apple are saying, we won't touch the healthcare system, but we'll help the consumers get direct access to their data through FHIR, through the standards. So it's niche. Google are coming and saying, we don't need to write a healthcare application when we can just focus on deploying Google Brain and our AI and our search software to leverage the availability of data by providing smart analysis. Microsoft are coming and saying, we're going to provide you with a platform so you can write your apps. We don't have to write the healthcare apps because we don't want to do that, but we want to look at it as a platform. So all the big 6 companies, Oracle, Salesforce, Amazon, they're all looking at it and saying, we can bring our niche specialty, the thing we're really good at, to healthcare without taking on the whole problem. And so companies like Epic and Cerner and so forth around the world, they're like, actually, it's a pretty good thing for us. We like interoperability because it means we don't have to compete with them head on. They can basically help us with their niche skills, and we don't have to compete with their niche skills because they don't have to compete with ours. And that's kind of how it's starting to play out. It's work in progress.
Fantastic response there. So I remember vaguely you advise for the US government as well in some form.
Oh yeah, I do regularly advise US government around standards adoption as part of my role. Yeah.
Right. And how is it different in terms of mindset and thinking to Australia? And
it's really interesting because here in Australia, the government is the service provider for healthcare. And so it thinks very much in terms of solutions rather than market infrastructure. And so the government is always trying to sort of wishing that the market would move while not actually moving the market. In the States, they understand that they're not the service provider. And so they look at the infrastructure overall of the healthcare system and say, in order to move the infrastructure, we have to move the market. How do you move the market? And there's a variety of ways you can move the market: through payment manipulation, through regulation, by brute force, by carrots and sticks, by helping the industry build coalitions and funding the industry to work together to build standards and expectations, and by presenting at conferences. And so the US government has used a combination of those features over a sustained 15-year period to migrate the market away from silos towards deeply interoperable products using cloud and FHIR and secure web services and so forth, with API accelerators and a whole ecosystem around that. They have said it's not our business to provide the software, but it's our business to provide the market conditions that lead to software innovation and improved services. Whereas in Australia, the government has never taken that as a consistent approach. It arbitrarily makes some rule that suits itself in order to develop the system that it thinks it wants, the solution that it thinks it wants. My HR is a solution, not a framework for systems. And then it wonders why it doesn't have a market that responds in a meaningful way. And it's really embarrassing to point to the US system and say the US got it right. Look at the healthcare
Yeah, I think
system.
they're one of the worst, aren't they, in terms of
But in
GDP expenditure?
this case, I believe that the US system has got it right and the Australian system has consistently got it wrong.
Right.
And I'm not saying overall, obviously we would not want the US system overall, but in this regard, the US system has got it right. But it's still a work in progress for them. Like at the moment, they have spent a lot, they've made a lot of the investment and they're seeing the transition infrastructurally. But if you talk to the consumers, whether they're healthcare providers or healthcare receivers, they're like, this was a big titanic waste of money. But the under the hood infrastructure transition is happening. It still needs to be brought home, and there's significant challenges in bringing it home. So it's possible that they'll screw it up yet, but it's certainly, from my point of view, looking good if you look under the hood.
Right, that's interesting. I remember you defined it as plumbing.
It is totally what we do is plumbing.
And I think there's an argument against in Australia around the government stifling innovation. They shouldn't be involved, providing the services in that way.
Well, the Australian government, the Australian healthcare system is very top-down, very centralised,
right,
very characterised by a contest between federal and state. I very much wish that Kevin Rudd had stayed around long enough to federalise the healthcare system. Would have been a screaming disaster for a few years, but we would have ended up with a system that didn't have fiefdoms and finger pointing and so forth. But within the system, all the players are super motivated to play ball with the regulators. So the kind of innovation that the regulators allow is totally worth pursuing, and there's lots of enthusiastic pursuit. But the kind of innovation that they don't allow is really hard to pursue, and pursuing it as a political thing rather than a business thing. And that stifles some kinds of innovation, important kinds of innovation. Like it's embarrassing when I look around the world at the number of different approaches I'm seeing tried out as ways to improve patient outcomes. And we just can't try those approaches of improving patient outcomes here because we can only do fractional improvements within the way the funding models work and the approvals and the liabilities. And we just can't take on the big picture in Australia, and it's embarrassing.
So are you referring specifically to like value-based healthcare and things like that? Outcome?
Well, I mean, value-based healthcare is clearly one of the transitions you need to make. But value-based healthcare it's really hard to define value. It's really hard to measure outcomes in terms of value. It's really hard to align the healthcare systems to consistently produce value. So I don't think it's any kind of nirvana. It's part of an overall picture, and definitely need a value-based approach. But there's lots of other parts around coordination and consistency and accountability outside institutional walls. My general argument is institutions keep records and institutions manage policies for the benefit of the institutions, not for the benefit of the healthcare provider people or the people who are receiving healthcare. And in this regard, the institutions are increasingly the problem, not the solution. The solution is not to get rid of institutions. We well, for all sorts of reasons, we'll continue to have institutions and must, but we really need to break the boundaries of the institutions so that the healthcare system becomes individually focused rather than institutional focused. But for a lot of people, they'll be listening to what I'm saying, It's the water they swim in. And what does it look like? Why are we even doing it? Because this is how it always has been. But overseas, they're doing the work around, regional areas that have a single patient record rather than a patient record for each institution, or where the care is based on a record that the patient owns rather than the institution owning the record. And so they all contribute to the central patient record. And if any of you, which is a common experience in my family, if any of you have ever gone to a doctor and he said you shouldn't be on this treatment, then you've run into the problem. And that's a ubiquitous experience, and we take it for granted that that's how the healthcare system should be. But in what world can a patient resolve an argument between two doctors? It doesn't make any sense. And yet that's the world we live in.
So on that point about who owns the records, I mean, there's this argument where the clinician writes notes in there, like their impressions or clinical diagnosis. Who owns who? What's your view on that? Like, does the patient own it? Does the IT provider own it?
My own personal inclination is that the record of the observations of the patient, the data derived from the patient, the diagnoses associated with the patient, and the treatment provided to the patient belongs with the patient. It's the patient's data, whereas the deliberations about why certain treatments are allowed or considered, and trade-offs between choosing between different patients to treat them, the record of how the care was provided is the institution's record, not the patient's record. But there's a huge gray zone in the middle there.
Gray, isn't it? Yeah.
That I wouldn't care to be having to define. In the States, I specifically asked the Office of Civil Rights, and their response, I actually put that question to them, and their response was, if it names the patient, it's the patient's record, which is pretty radical interpretation.
Interesting.
Whereas I'm not aware of any ruling or any court case or any regulation that answers this question in Australia as to which bits of the record are the patient. Does the patient have the right to access, or the patient have the right to own? But in some countries, they've moved beyond this and said the patient owns the record. It's not even a question. You get access to the patient's record as an institution when you care for the patient. And so that the question starts to go away, because anything that you want to share with anybody who's caring for the patient is the patient's information.
Wow. So have they considered the risks of exposing that information to the patient in terms of adverse, health outcomes, like, things like mental health and triggering certain disease or exacerbations of things? Looking at
the most common cases arise around child and adolescent healthcare. And there's active debate, really fertile and emotional debate around the questions of sexual health for younger teenagers, mental health for younger teenagers, child abuse, particularly for younger kids. And this is absolutely necessary for a healthcare provider to have a place where they can record data that's not available to the patient. And the places that are experimenting with patient-owned records are not exploring those areas at this time. They're working through adult healthcare issues. And I don't know what the solution is. And some of them may, I think, are generally unresolvable by policy, only by trust, which is in short supply. So I don't know the answer to those questions.
No worries. Very complicated gray area, isn't it?
It is.
Okay, so last point here is for innovators out there, whether they want to transform their own organizations in Australia or worldwide, or an entrepreneur who wants to do a startup. What's your realistic tough love feedback on where to start, what game they should play, given the mess in the interoperability, integrations?
There's any number of innovations that you could pursue. And it doesn't take long if you get healthcare people brainstorming before they start coming up with really compelling cases for innovation. But what I've seen is also it doesn't take long at all before you start running into innovation ideas that are simply not possible because they require access to data that doesn't exist, or they require changes to policy that can't happen, or changes to regulation or liability that will never be considered. And so the essence of the innovation story in Australia is list your external dependencies, the things you need other people to do that you can't do by yourself. If you, and my advice generally, this general case, is that if that list is empty, then you're not moving the needle. But if that list has anything on it, then you have a big problem. And you need to actually identify the external dependencies and solve those first before you go raise money. Because if you raise money or you spend your own money or you put your own time into it and you can't resolve those external dependencies, you're gonna fail. And those external dependencies, someone else needs to do something for you. They're the things that count. And like I said, if you don't have any of those, you're probably not moving the needle.
That's great wisdom there.
Yeah, it's a really good advice.
I've noticed there's a few articles around saying a lot of these digital health startups or initiatives never pass pilot.
I mean, that might be why. The ones I've looked at, I mean, some of them you look at it, you look at the founders and you go, you guys have no idea. You really don't understand the system, the framework that you're working in. You've got a good idea and you're so in love with the good idea, which is generally quite techy, you really haven't thought through what DevOps and adoption and implementation and change process and resolving external dependencies looks like. You have no idea. Others, they have an idea and they give it a really good shot and it's pretty impressive. So one particular project I looked at is a beautiful project for managing comms within the hospital, but the biggest external dependency they had was, would the entire institution reconceptualize the way they communicated with each other? Now, if they had arrived on March the 16th, 2020, the answer would have been yes. But any other day of ever, the answer was never. So external dependencies matter.
Very interesting. I love the way you think through that. And it's great. It's a great mindset that people should adopt. I'm a software engineer as well as a physio. So it's kind of like looking at all the interrelationships first and mapping that out, right?
Yeah.
It's like writing code and not being aware.
And the biggest risk for any innovation in Australia is that you'll run into some regulatory barrier that you didn't appreciate, you didn't realize. And that's a huge problem. You've got to actually do, quite a lot of work mapping out your solution and figuring out how it works and actually prototyping stuff. And then you discover your external dependencies. I wish there was a better way, but that's why innovation is risky. And that's why it pays off too.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks for your time, Grahame. That's been excellent. I can say that some of your thoughts from when we last caught up have evolved
a little bit. I'm going to add one more thing.
Yes.
I hear a lot of people bandy around technology as if technology is the problem here. But it's been my mantra for many years that all of our problems now relate not to technology, but to information management. And people tend to kind of conflate IT and IM, but our problems really are information management and people management. And my common phrase is that interoperability and innovation are not technology problems, they're people problems. And for me, that speaks very loudly to the kind of people who should be actually trying to solve these problems. Too many of the people who should solve the problems think they can't because they're IT problems, but they're just not technology problems, they're people and management and information flow problems.
Great. That's a missing part. A lot of people say it's people problems. It's not a technology problem. It's in digital health. I hear that all the time. Yeah. but I haven't heard it as an information problem, information flow problem. How do people get involved in that specifically if they don't know anything about interoperability? How do they influence that information flow, or, you know, like get rid of the blockages or bottlenecks? What can they do? What are the first practical steps they can do as an intrapreneur or entrepreneur with a low budget, trying to get their app or whatever it is out there?
You know that a lot of the problems that we can solve really consist of automating what could be done on paper. So it's really, can I imagine how you would do this on paper in an extremely structured form with boxes and so forth on the paper? You don't need to know the technology if you can show how it would work on paper, and then you just wind up the paper speed, and now you have a working app. Now, the second phase is where you break free of the constraints of paper. And that's harder to visualize and harder to contextualize. But the things that most people can get their heads around is simply automating the paper flow and doing that really, really quickly.
Right.
And so I think that as a innovator, it's a good way to think about things. You know, we talked about the My Health Record before. The My Health Record is essentially, imagine that after you see the patient, you've got to write down a form of these are the diagnoses, these are whatever, and then send it off to the government. Well, hey, they automated that. That's the My Health Record, right? And it goes in a file that the patient can go up to Canberra and get a copy of. Bingo. It's just automating the paper, right? And so you could imagine better solutions for paper, automating paper than that. But a lot of it is, we still have an incredible paper-based form or faxing, but it's all paper.
Still around today,
right? And all we need to do is figure out, if you could imagine how it would work with paper, then someone can automate it. And like I said, there's a step where you get beyond that kind of constraint, and it's harder to imagine, and you need experience doing this work. But to get going, can I imagine how to do this on paper? And if I can, then a computer can make it happen really quickly.
That's an excellent point. I mean, it comes back to first principles, doesn't it? Like,
yeah,
really
it is.
fundamental.
Yeah.
So common
Imagine it
sense.
on paper.
People go to the fancy without thinking, you know, what can be solved with paper. Like,
yeah, and I mean, you can assume things like the cost of just sending paper from A to B is you know, it is costless, and the cost of cloning it, you know, photocopying it is costless. But is it possible? It's the possibility is defined by, I can imagine how this could be done on paper, and then I can figure out how to automate it.
and would you say like having a single source of truth would be ultimately the best, or is that not going to happen? No.
It's a trade-off, right?
Yep.
Clearly, any piece of information that you clone somewhere is now a problem, because it could get stale, out of date, and be wrong. You know, where's the patient's latest record? If I, as a doctor, I pull the record and I photocopy it and put it on my page, and then put the record back and proceed to treat based on the photocopy, then I totally miss what happens in the main record when someone else deals with the patient. So clearly, every time you make a copy of the information, you have that synchronization problem and working on stale information. On the other hand, if you say, we will ruthlessly hunt down every single copy and get rid of it and force everybody to go back to the original master copy, you're actually permutating complexity, because everything that everybody ever wants to do gets done on the master. And so there's no world in which only one copy, only one master copy is a workable approach. There's no world in which everybody copies information everywhere is a workable approach. It's always a tension between the two. And for any given system, based on its dynamicness and the critical importance of safety and so forth, that I choose to trade between some copy and some source access. As an IT person, IT people always migrate in their heads towards single source access and complexity.
A cloud.
But in the real world, the price mounts rapidly. And I have worked on systems, long-term systems, where the number of people who can actually maintain the core single source system is very few, because it's so complicated. The rules are so complex and so forth. And you can imagine that with a single, like, who runs the HIM system, and it's got so complicated, the rules for getting, you know, records in and out. There's only a few people in the institution who can cope with it, right? It's still, you can get this stuff with paper. And so it's always compromises between, you know, integrity and consistency and currency.
It's a very complex issue there, isn't it? It's kind of like building a complex CRM enterprise.
Well, I mean, those are the same issues for the same reason.
Like with the plumbing, right? Like the back end and the databases and the relationships between the databases gets really complex over time.
That's right.
Great. All right, Grahame. So if anyone wants to reach out to you, do you still do consulting and things like that?
Oh yeah, I do consulting principle, but in practice I'm way overcommitted. But I can always talk to people.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. All right, Grahame. Thanks for your time. Lovely to have you, and great to see the insights in 2022 during COVID. I'm not going to say
yeah.
I think there's another wave coming.
Yeah.
Thanks, Grahame.
Right. Thanks, Barry. Bye.